Well, we're always great to talk to local authors, and someone who probably has stepped into the Eleanor London Cote-saint-luc Public Library in his lifetime a few times is my old friend Ian Halperin, joining us from Miami. Welcome, Ian.
Hey, Mike, pleasure to be here. And yeah, that library is amazing. I think it's probably one of the best in Canada, not only Quebec.
I would agree with you. And first off, Ian, of course, a famous author. We're going to get into that in a minute, but love to see that you're wearing your Montreal Expos hat.
Well, for me, Montreal will not be complete until the return of the Expos. I believe that they were almost stolen to Washington, and there was a lot of mismanagement if you go back to the days of Claude Brochu. And Montreal, without a baseball team, the Expos, is almost like McDonald's being without a Big Mac. It makes no sense.
Well, I would love to see one of your investigative books in the future delve into the Lauria situation, the Expos, everything that went into that. That'd be a
Lauria
great
had
series.
the same rap in Miami. I used to see him a lot. I've lived in Miami for years, and I
Yeah.
used to eat at the same restaurant as him a lot.
Oh, yeah.
He also had a bad name in Florida. I mean,
Yeah.
wherever he went, he left bad blood.
Bad karma. So, Ian, you and I first met when we worked together on the Dawson plant. And then, of course, we actually had somewhat of a rivalry at Concordia, where I was the sports editor of the Concordian, and you were breaking stories on
Well,
the link.
I still tell everyone, they say, who was your best editor ever? I kid you not. I said it has to be the leadoff, Mike Cohen, because
I'm
you
so
were
honored.
tough, man. You
I'm
were
so
you were tough on the plant. You really were a perfectionist, and you expected the best. And I remember I used to come into the office and used to be laying out the paper. You really worked your ass off, and you were a perfectionist from day one.
it's hard for me to believe, how long ago that was, but how efficient we were in putting out a weekly newspaper at a CJEP. I mean, I was covering soccer and handball, and people read it, but
I know.
it was great.
And you also worked, I remember at the same time, you were working under Bob Amess at the
That's right,
Sunday
Sunday
Express.
Express.
So
Shout out for Bob Amess, exactly.
You were so busy back then, but
I started being a workaholic at 16, and I've never stopped. And now
I know.
I say 16, and now I'm the same numbers twisted around. Now it's 61. So
I'll say one thing. Honestly, I've worked with some of the top editors in the world, having worked at some of the biggest book publishing houses in the world. But really, one of the only editors I remember is yourself, because back then you gave me advice that stick with me for the rest of my career. And you were a perfectionist.
I think I told you, Ian, don't ever get anybody mad at you. You didn't listen to me.
I didn't listen to you there for sure. But, it's all part and parcel of the job. People say, because I've written a lot of controversial, so-called quote unquote controversial stuff over the years. And people say, oh, do people try to kill you? And, I say, look, I sleep very well. It's just a job. And for me, it's just doing the historical analysis and public discourse, putting it out there. But, one thing, I've lasted in this business for so long, still working in book publishing, because nobody's ever proven one word I ever wrote as being untrue. And, that's the key. The truth hurts. The truth hurts a lot of people. When I did this book, by the way, let me give it a plug. Here it is.
There, now I can see it clearly. Yes.
Yeah. BIGOT, Roger Waters, Mel Gibson, Kanye West, and the new anti-Semitism. Look, I spent 7 years writing this book to really make people rethink their assumptions and the nature and meaning of Jewish history and the history of relations between Jews and non-Jews. And I interviewed so many people in this book. One of my mentors on this was the amazing Dr. Charles Small, another Montrealer.
Yeah.
We traveled all over the world together. And I'll say one thing. Dr. Small was the first person who told me about contemporary anti-Semitism, a Montrealer. And I've met everyone from the head of the World Jewish Congress. I interviewed Dershowitz, the Pope, Tony Blair. But Dr. Charles Small was the first person to warn me about the perils of contemporary anti-Semitism. And he really wanted me to do something for years. And I finally took his advice, traveled all over the world, and my book came out maybe 5 days before October 7th. And since then, I've added a chapter on October 7th. And ironically, the day of the barbaric attacks, I was the keynote speaker in a Muslim country in Istanbul at a Future Tech conference, because I'd written a book about crypto last year. And I had trouble getting out, Mike. There were taxis that day saying no Jews allowed, no Israelis allowed.
Really?
I have photos. So, unfortunately, what we've learned, which is becoming a critical resource for policymakers, journalists, anti-Semitism studies, is the world's true colors subsequently of October 7th have come out. I don't know what's worse, Mike. The barbaric attacks by Hamas, who I out in my book as, being one of the most terrorist-laden organizations, not caring about their own people in the world, or 3/4 of the world endorsing this. If you look at all the protests, and look, I know you're doing an amazing job as a city councillor in Cote-Saint-Luc over these years. People love you, and congratulations on 18 years of amazing work.
Thank you.
And I urge everyone to get behind Mike, because he's the real deal. The real deal. I've seen him since age, how old were you then? 17, 18?
Yeah. 18 when we first met, probably 18 or 19.
And until now, the guy is the truth. Like, remember that guy, Carl the Truth Williams? You're Mike the Truth Cohen.
Oh, that's a good nickname. I'll accept that.
And that's all you do. So, is to help people, and you've helped so many people over the years, including myself. But the fact of the matter is, with all these protests going on in Montreal, I've been following it. It's unreal. I mean, they're firebombing Jewish schools. This is horrific. And this is what I deal with in the book, is that contemporary anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is thriving more than ever, as we've seen subsequently from the October 7th attacks. And in my book, in a very fair manner, I try to outline the psychology behind it, how we can build bridges, because I still do have hope. Hamas, yes, they're the worst organization on the planet. They're a bunch of barbaric terrorists. But when I did this book, BIGOT, I went and interviewed people on both sides, at least 400 Israelis. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and about 400 Palestinians. And at the end of this, I said, does anybody here want a war? Everybody wanted to work together, to break bread together. They thought they had more in common than more apart. And it was, unfortunately, what we see now. It's just spiraled out of control. And of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. Come on, man. 1,400 people murdered October 7th, babies kidnapped. It's barbaric. But I'll caution everyone watching this. Those are just the leaders of Hamas. The Palestinian people are actually a great people who, a lot of them, respect Israel, and they want a solution for peace. That's all they want.
Yeah. I've been there 7 times, and I saw a lot of Palestinian people, a lot of Palestinian businesses. But it is ironic that you spent 7 years and you released this book. The timing is impeccable, and we're not smiling about it. But you're writing a book about anti-Semitism, and we'll get into the personalities in a moment. And then we have the attack on October 7th. And then the world has a collective amnesia of what happened on that day. And anti-Semitism right now at McGill, at Concordia, in Dollar Des Ormeaux, in malls, and where anyone walks, anti-Semitism. We're just seeing it in Montreal. And you're seeing it all over the world. It's rampant, and it's scary.
Yeah, we've seen this from the beginning of the time. It's the oldest hatred in the world. We've seen it Rome, Greece, the Byzantine Empire, medieval Europe, early and modern Europe. We've seen the Spanish Inquisition, North America, and the United Kingdom. But for it to be happening, first of all, since the last rounds of artillery were fired in 1945, Never did we thought people would be on their heels. They would never want this to repeat, never again. And to see what happened October 7th, and then the world's horrific reaction to it, we have to really realize out there, for some reason, the oldest form of hatred in the world is flourishing, unfortunately. But I'll warn the world this: there could be one Jew left in the world, but we're still going to come back bigger and stronger than ever, because, you know, there's 14 million of us in the world, and Israel's not perfect. I say you could criticize Israel's policy, you could, you know, that's fair game. But first of all, to deny the right of the state of Israel, that's the contemporary anti-Semitism. That makes you an anti-Semite today. And if you look at the critical resource to study this, and I spent, again, 7 years, and the impetus for this was when I was driving in Los Angeles. I was working, I'm also a filmmaker, so I was working in Los Angeles for Universal. And I'm driving one day and I hear on the car radio Roger Waters, the leader of Pink Floyd, being interviewed and saying that Israel is worse than Nazi Germany. I almost drove off a cliff, Mike, hearing that. It's the most false, egregious statement I have ever heard in my life. And then Roger Waters, at that time, goes on to become the #1 solo grossing artist of all time. The two groups at that time were the Rolling Stones and U2, top grossing acts, and then Roger Waters. And a lot of Jewish arena owners, they turned a blind eye to this. And I encourage them, people in Toronto, in Philadelphia, you know, Atlanta, I personally called them and said, what are you doing, man? If Roger Waters was wearing a white sheet on stage and condoning the re-enslavement of African Americans, he'd be shut down, let alone probably killed after concert 1, and not be allowed to do this for a dozen years. But with the Jews, for some reason, it's fair game. And that, to me, is the most concerning thing. It's very hypocritical, it's unethical, and people who put money into Roger Waters' pockets over the years should be highly ashamed of themselves.
Ian, you're the son of a Holocaust survivor. You make it very clear in the book your motivation for writing this book. The book is brilliantly written. I couldn't wait till the next page arrived, and you basically give a really good history for people who don't know about the Holocaust, about Hitler, about everything that happened, and then you get into the different personalities. So how long, growing up as the son of a Holocaust survivor, did you think about writing a book like this?
I never did until the great Dr. Charles Small, a Montrealer from Chamonix. I was doing a project in Finland about 9 years ago, and Dr. Small calls me, because at that time I was doing a lot of celebrity stuff. I was always on like CBS, ABC, all those serious. Howard Stern.
That's incredible. You took a bucket item out of my list that I'll never achieve.
Howard Stern. Howard's a great guy. Howard, in fact, his longtime boss, producer Tim Sabian's one of my best friends. But Howard's a mensch. Whenever I went on the show, Howard would have me on for at least an hour, one-on-one.
I know.
But then I switched to Opie and Anthony. My manager got me that gig. And as much as I love Opie and Anthony and doing it for 12 years, I still miss Stern. And in fact, for the first time in years, I was just in contact with Howard and his people in the last week or so, talking about what's going on in the Mideast. Howard called out Roger Waters.
Yeah, I remember you wrote about that in the book. Yeah.
Yes. And Howard, in fact, in my opinion, I mean, his longtime book publisher is also one of my best friends, Judith Regan. And Judith told me a lot of stories about Howard. And one thing she said about Howard is he has to be the best interviewer we've ever seen.
Yeah, he is.
He is just so good. But Howard is extremely pro-Israel, great guy. And the fact of the matter is, when you see people like Kanye West Roger Waters and Mel Gibson parading all these anti-Semitic sentiments over the years. In the update for my book, Bigot, I said, based on an interview with a Palestinian musician recently, that those people, those celebrities actually inspired Hamas over the years. They had posters of Roger Waters and Kanye West in their offices and listened to Pink Floyd music all day.
Right.
So it's dangerous when people with a public platform come on with uneducated opinions, false opinions. Anybody who says Israel is worse than Nazi Germany, it's the most false statement. Or when they say Israel's an apartheid state, well, apartheid was a two-class system. Israel is not. There's over 2 million Israeli Arabs living there. A lot of them are in the Knesset. A lot of them are in the IDF fighting now.
Mm-hmm.
And for there to be, Mike, less than 2 million Jews now left in Europe, there were 9.8 million before the war. After World War II, there was about 3.8 left. There were 6 million murdered. And now they've been driven out in droves because contemporary anti-Semitism is so much prevalent in Europe today. There's less than 2 million Jews, and Jews have been such a huge contributors to European culture, business, everything over centuries. And it's abhorrent for there to be less than, and 1 million of those Jews in Europe left are in Russia today. So there's just a paucity of Jews left in France. Most of them have left, the UK. And I met with the director of security intelligence of the Jewish community in the UK with Dr. Small a few years ago. We went there, we were blindfolded, we weren't allowed to see where their headquarters was. But when I interviewed the guy, he said, look, if you know what's really going on here with all these Hamas terrorist bunkers and Iran and Qatar infiltrating the UK, it's like a war zone in itself going on. And the UK leads the world in random acts of random violent acts of anti-Semitic attacks in the Western world. It's really concerning. And the fact of the matter is, in France, at least they've taken action since the kosher market. You know, I was in France, unfortunately, for both the Bataclan and the kosher market attacks. And it was terrible, man. People, the Jews were so distraught, everybody. But since those attacks, at least France has put in some regulations. They've tried to dissuade people from doing these pro-Palestine protests during this very sensitive period of the war now.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid when I see what's going on, I have to say to Montrealers, many who I've known and loved, look, get more involved. You know, a lot of them complain about anti-Semitism. I remember when I showed my movie about contemporary anti-Semitism, Wish You Weren't Here, was sold out at the old Forum there. And I'll say this, though. When push comes to shove, we cannot disappear from the moment of truth. And now is the moment of truth, not for only Jews, but for any supporter of Israel in the world. And I'm calling on any Jew or supporter of Israel in the world to donate 1 day of their salary to either the Friends of the IDF or any of the legitimate organizations on the front lines helping first responders or the IDF soldiers, the brave soldiers who are fighting to protect Israel.
So you've talked about Roger Waters. There's a lot in the book about him. There's stuff about Mel Gibson, whose anti-Semitic acts are well known. What about Donald Trump? You have some words for Donald Trump in your book.
You know, I have a love-hate relationship with Trump because 3.5 years ago when he spoke in Miami at the, I think it was the Diplomat, and they invited me, and they put me in like the second or third row. I was sitting next to Ben Carson, and I got to give Trump credit. He gave a hell of a speech, an amazing speech. I've met Ivanka on the tennis court. She seems really nice. I've met all of them, actually. Eric's wife once interviewed me, Lana. I remember her. She used to work at Inside Edition right
Oh.
before she joined the Trump campaign. And I
Okay.
cracked a Trump joke during this was when I did my Kardashian book in 2016. And I didn't know who she was. You know, I was doing one of those media tours. So I
Yeah.
go to Inside Edition, and this hot blonde journalist is interviewing me, and I crack a Trump joke, and you could hear a pin drop.
Oh
And
my.
the camera people say, Ian, do you know who's interviewing you? I
Oh
said,
my.
that's Trump's daughter-in-law. So
Oh
look,
my.
the only thing with Trump, I'll say this. I do believe you don't know what you're getting with Donald. If he loves the Jews, he's a Zeta. He has Jewish grandkids.
Yeah.
But after Charlottesville, it took him time to condemn the attacks. And a true leader would have condemned white nationalism like that to its finest form in a second. And he didn't. And he gave it time to keep, to keep growing that whole movement. And yes, he condemned it a day or two later, but it was too late because the damage had already been done when he praised them initially.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact, because I know a lot of people in the Trump campaign, he was under immense pressure to correct it. So, sort of like January 6th. It took him a lot of time, and then he corrects it. It took him hours until he called for nonviolence. And so that's the only thing I have with Trump. I'm not political, man. I just believe if you don't support Israel, I don't care what party you're in, to me, you're an anti-Semite. And because Israel deserves its home, and it's the home to the Jewish people, and not only Jews, there's a ton of non-Jews living there. But if not supporting Israel and calling for it to be, an apartheid state, to me, is the new anti-Semitism.
So finally, and a final note on your book,
Sure.
you write about the Pope. You've had personal audiences with the Pope, and I couldn't believe that there was a cost. You had to basically, some very wealthy Jewish people.
Yeah. What happened was this. What happened was this. It wasn't, they wanted a donation, a little donation to get access to him, I think, the second time. And what could we do? But it was all good fun. What are we going to do? Everybody, all these organizations, but I felt a bit bad because the Vatican, it has a sordid history itself of anti-Semitism, and I really didn't want to donate to them. I mean, they own apparently so much Nazi art still. It's hidden in all their archives. So what am I going to do? I'm in Rome. I want an interview, and then one of the guys asked for a donation. So some guy ponied up. But I'll say this. Pope Francis is actually very pro-Israel and extremely, extremely concerned about contemporary anti-Semitism, and I respect him for that. He really spoke out against contemporary anti-Semitism, and he said, in no shape or form will he give time of day to anybody calling for the dissolution of the state of Israel. And to me, that meant a lot. He was a true mensch, and I think he's put a good name into the Vatican compared to what we've had in the past.
Right. So I've read and written about a lot of your books. You're first of all a New York Times best-selling author. It doesn't.
Well, I'm the only Canadian to ever go #1.
I mean, it doesn't get any better than that.
No. Let me tell you something, Mike, because I know when it comes to sports, nobody beats you. And I'll say this, I say it in all my speeches, going #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, it's easier to win an Olympic gold medal or, to go to the moon. It is extremely difficult. Let me tell you, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. You just don't go #1. A lot of work put into it. I'm the only Canadian to go #1 in nonfiction ever. And some woman before the list in the 40s went #1 in fiction. So look, unfortunately, Canada, you're stuck with me because there's been much better writers than me, like Atwood, Leonard Cohen, but none of them remotely went #1. I did.
And you're certainly the only graduate of Garden View Elementary School and Laurel Hill Academy to probably go #1 on the New York Times.
Well,
I'd like to end on that note, Ian.
Yeah.
What are your recollections from those two schools?
Excellent schools.
It was Sir Winston Churchill when you went, but now it's called Laurel Hill Academy.
In fact, if I'd have to restart my whole journey, I wouldn't do anything different with those schools. They're top notch. and very multicultural, a lot of diversity in the staff and the very progressive thinking. And it's like a family there. You know, I remember, must have been 10, 12 years ago, you brought me there to speak.
Yeah.
And it was a great experience just to see how great those schools actually are, especially compared to schools in the
Yeah.
US where you don't know
Well,
what you're getting.
we're definitely down the line. When you make a future visit to Montreal, we're going to do it again. There's a lot to talk to the students about. I mean, like I said, your books going from Michael Jackson to Kurt Cobain, and you know, the list is endless, but so many amazing books.
But this is the most important.
But BIGOT right now is available on Amazon,
Yeah.
at bookstores, and I hope, Ian, you'll find a way to come do a signing in Montreal in the
Of
future.
course. Hey, Mike, thank you, and congratulations on your success. And keep going, man. You're a legend in Montreal. And really, I just have to ask you one last question, because
Yeah.
you used to cover the Alouettes. I remember you used to cover the Manic. You were the first guy.
That's right.
So let me tell you something, man. I go to South America about 3 months a year, and I work on films there and stuff. I go to football matches there, soccer matches, and I say, man, this guy Cohen, he knew what he was doing back then. Because when I go to those football matches, let's say I go to Colombia, the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, they have nothing on those fans, man. It's electric.
Yeah.
Electric. But I remember you covered the Manic and Tony Towers. Do you remember him?
Number 8, Tony Towers. I can name you every player on the roster, and I also covered the Dawson Soccer Blues. So there you go.
I know.
Yeah.
You were ahead of your time, man, because I became, just in the last few years, so into soccer, man. I love it. But you were 30 years ahead.
Absolutely. Ian, thanks so much.
Thank
Keep
you,
up
Mike.
the great work, and we'll talk to you again soon. Ian
Thank you for
Halperin
everything.
has been my guest.